Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Greg Sadler. Greg did his PhD in philosophy at Southern Illinois University and is the president and co-founder of Reason.io. And today we're talking about philosophy and anger. So, Greg, thanks for talking with me today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I know you've talked about this in some of your videos, but can you share a bit about your own experience and journey with anger and how philosophy and anger is something you started thinking more about?
Sure. Yeah, it's something I've struggled with since childhood. And when I got into philosophy as a graduate student, then I started to become more interested in whether there might be resources in philosophy that would help me with it. I did so many things out of anger that I wound up getting in a good bit of trouble when I was a kid. Actually wound up as a ward of the court for some time because my mother filed an uncontrollability petition, and it ruined a lot of relationships and stood in the way of professional development or opportunities. So I thought that philosophy ought to provide some sort of guidance on that. And I was really struck when I got to graduate school. I don't know if this is more of a feature of my school that I went to, but philosophers are supposed to be these very reasonable people, and
right.
We elevate rationality to this prime value or virtue.
Right.
And I would see these people get in shouting matches with each other, not just graduate students, but the professors, over sometimes trivial things, and hold grudges for a long time.
Yeah.
And now, it wasn't just the philosophy people, the English people, the history people, the speech comm. I saw other people doing this as well.
Sure.
But I thought, well, if there's any discipline where you would think this wouldn't be the case, it would be philosophy.
Yeah.
And so there was that. And then I was studying people within the history of philosophy in ancient and medieval philosophy, mostly on my own or with the classics department, because the philosophy department at SIU really wasn't into that sort of thing. And I started finding all sorts of interesting discussions about anger in ancient philosophers like Aristotle or Epictetus. Plato, of course, the part of the soul that gets angry plays a major role in the Republic, the thumos, the middle part.
Yeah.
And the more that I started digging around and reading widely and researching, the more I found throughout the entire history of philosophy, really all the way into the 19th century, there were these excellent discussions about what anger does and what it is and how it works and whether it's ever legitimate or not, and how we can start to, redirect it, or in some cases get rid of it altogether. So I got into it originally as a research topic through Aristotle because it plays a very important role in his ethics. There's one virtue that's devoted specifically to anger. We translate it as gentleness or good temper or mildness, and the Greek word for that is praotes. And interestingly, that also is used in the Septuagint and in New Testament Greek, but it's translated there as meekness.
Okay.
So, sometimes the ways in which we render words or translate them conceals how there's this continuity of discussion. So, for example, in the Septuagint, when Moses is said to be meek, they don't mean that he's a meek person who's, walking around with his head down or anything like that. He gets angry at people.
Right.
But other than a few instances where he goes overboard with it, he gets angry sort of in an Aristotelian way at the right time for the right reason and for, to the right extent.
Huh.
Although one fit of anger cost him the vision of the Holy Land. Actually, if you think about what a pain in the rear those nagging Israelites were,
right,
you can understand him getting angry. It's surprising he got angry as little as he did.
Yeah. Right.
But so I started, researching this, and I saw that there were all these discussions and connections. And then, I looked at the resources that were available to us because I was also in therapy and counseling, and quite often they were inferior in the extent and in sort of their theoretical scope to what we have from philosophy, or also religious discussions about anger. And then I thought it would be much more powerful to put all of those things together.
Yeah.
So that became a research project. I did some writing on it, and I do a lot of work with my clients on anger management informed by philosophy, but also by psychology, some insights from religious texts as well.
So it wasn't a case of you thinking like, I'm interested in anger and I'm going to pour through the pages of philosophy and see what I can find about anger. It was just in your general study of reading Aristotle and these medieval thinkers that you just found them talking about anger.
Yeah, I didn't start at the beginning with a deliberate research program to look for those discussions.
Yeah.
But then after a while, once I found several of them, I was like, wow, I wonder who else discusses this. And as I started reading, some of the early church fathers, many of them were philosophers or had philosophical training, I found they had a lot of interesting discussions. Like Lactantius has an entire book called On Divine Anger, which turns out to be more about human anger than divine anger.
Okay.
And he talks about the positions of the Epicureans and the Aristotelians and the Stoics and how his view of the Christian position is that it's better. Augustine talks about anger. Chrysostom does,
Yeah.
There's quite a few people who thematize it. And they draw upon some scriptural texts and try to interpret them, and they draw upon ordinary experience, and then they also, they've been exposed to the philosophical culture of their time, which already included centuries of reflection on anger. So they're trying to bring this stuff together in a well put together synthesis that could help people to get through their day-to-day life.
Right. Yeah, it's funny, I think, I'm sure you experience this as well. When I'm teaching students philosophy, one of the, I think, false impressions of philosophy is it's this kind of abstract, irrelevant, kind of impractical discipline. And one of the first things that I try to do in my philosophy classes is to try to deconstruct that for my students right away. That, actually philosophy is deeply concerned about the day-to-day course of your life and how you live well.
Yeah. And that's in large part due to generations of philosophers who did make it completely abstract and impractical and really something just for elites. And they did us a huge disservice, because even just on a very basic level, when we have to justify our existence, all these people who in the 60s and 70s and 80s were telling people, oh, you can't really understand philosophy. It's not for you.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any practical application.
Right.
Well, they really screwed us over, because, then everybody else thinks that philosophy is at best Monty Python skits or something like that.
Right. At its origins, it certainly was never about that.
Well, and actually through most of its history.
Right.
This whole idea of philosophy being as a discipline, not just as an individual endeavor, but as a discipline, would be totally abstract and is removed from ordinary life as much as possible. That's from the 19th century onward. Even thinkers like Hume and Descartes, they really think that what they're doing should impact one's daily life.
Yeah. So I've got 3 children. I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old and a newborn. And I'd say most of my life, I always considered myself a person who was pretty patient. And
yeah.
And, I didn't get angry that often. And then after having kids, I just discovered I was losing my temper all the time. And I feel terrible about it. You snap at your kids. And I think what I found, for me, it's probably more coming from an impatience, right? Of kind of like, okay, I've told you to do this again and again and again. And now I don't have any more patience. And so I'll yell or lose my temper or something like that. So what can the philosophers say to help in a situation like that?
Well, you can start analyzing what's happening when you're feeling angry and whether what you're doing would actually pay off in any way.
Sure.
And there's different analyses. You can use Aristotle for that, or the Stoics, or you can combine them. Usually anger has to do with some sort of sense that we're being slighted in some way. That's Aristotle's part of his definition. And slighting in Greek is olegoria. It means to be made less. And so when somebody doesn't pay attention to you, for example, you feel slighted.
Yeah.
And as an adult, especially a parent, but this applies to other cases too, where you're in charge of other people. It's easy to get angry because we are trying to keep it all together. We're trying to make sure everybody gets what they need and that things get done on time. And there's a sense that, well, why are we doing the stuff that we're doing if you're not going to hold up your end of the bargain, person that we get angry with, right?
Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
And, if you look at it that way, you can recognize the irrationality of our expectations.
Sure.
It's not totally irrational. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with expecting a kind of reciprocity from people much of the time. But to expect that from kids who are just sort of learning what it means to be a human being as it is, that's setting ourselves up for losing our tempers. Yeah.
Interestingly, the New Testament talks about a way to be angry without sinning.
Yeah.
That seems to be similar to the way Aristotle thinks about anger. There's kind of an appropriate way to be angry.
Yeah, and the early Christian thinker engagements with the topic of anger that are informed by philosophy, there's a really interesting dynamic that arises because of the existence of multiple manuscripts. So as the New Testament is circulating around and people are looking at the Sermon on the Mount, there's that three-part thing where Christ starts out saying, the law says don't kill, but, and then there's the three things about anger, one of which is, the middle one, if you call your brother Racha, which means something like fool or idiot or jackass, right?
Yeah.
And there's sort of a hierarchy of how bad is it? Now, in the very first one, there were some manuscripts that were circulating that said, if you become angry with your brother, and then others were circulating that said, if you become angry with your brother without cause. And so you'll find people like Chrysostom and John Cassian talking about this. And Augustine is willing to say, well, I think both of these could actually be on point because sometimes you should get angry. You got to watch it. You got to be really careful with it. Even Aristotle, who thinks that you can have, a good disposition with respect to anger, thinks that a lot of the time we're off base with our anger.
Yeah.
Others, like John Cassian, said it's never good to be angry. They were more like the Stoics in that respect. The Stoics were zero tolerance, and so was Cicero when it came to anger. And Cassian actually says, you people out there who are quoting this without cause, you're going the wrong way with this sort of thing. So there is this interesting conundrum, I guess you could say, posed by the fact that there were multiple versions circulating out there, some of which had that gloss in there and some of which didn't. And so, the question then is, what criteria do we have? Let's say we accept the idea that anger could sometimes be legitimate.
Yeah.
It's not always going to be a trap or one of the 7 deadly sins or something like that. What are the criteria that we can use to figure out when we're not across that line and when we're actually doing the right thing with it? And that's where I think the philosophical traditions are quite helpful.
Yeah. Can you talk specifically about Augustine, just kind of explain his account of anger and how he develops it? Because he's certainly influenced by Plato, but he's also a Christian. So can you talk about the way he thinks about anger?
Well, he doesn't have one place or one treatise where he covers it.
Okay.
You have to kind of piece together his account from some of his sermons and letters and remarks here and there. His view is that anger can be legitimate and that it can serve some important purposes, but we have to be super careful with it because it has a tendency to, if we nurse it for a long time, to congeal into hatred.
Yeah.
And hatred is never good, as an affect, you could say. Now, hatred for vice, okay, that's good, but that doesn't mean you have to be out there knocking people down and saying horrible things about them.
Yeah.
And so, he's got kind of a measured approach to it. The sort of standard line is that Augustine is a Platonist, although he's getting his Plato through the Neoplatonists.
Right.
The Neoplatonists were very synthetic. They often thought that, Plato is for the things above, and then Aristotle or the Stoics is for the things below. And so I imagine, we don't have access to these texts, but that he would have been encountering Aristotelian and Stoic treatments of the emotions because they're out there everywhere. I mean, he read Seneca, so he had that, and he read Cicero.
Yeah.
So he's familiar with those things as well.
Yeah. And then Aquinas, who is kind of trying to be this Augustinian, Aristotelian, I suppose. He talks about a little bit about this as well, doesn't he?
Well, he advances the conversation on anger, actually, quite significantly.
Yeah.
And yeah, he, again, that's sort of the standard line, and those are the two most important influences. But, if you look at specific topics, you'll see Aquinas bringing in all sorts of other people as well as his main interlocutors. And so, when it comes to anger, John Damascene is somebody who he'll mention from time to time, but John Cassian is even more important.
Okay.
Because, Cassian is sort of an extreme position on that. And Aquinas, what's really cool about his account, it's based in his psychology or anthropology, his view about the parts of the human mind or soul. He takes on this basically Aristotelian anthropology and twists it a bit. So we have two parts of he calls it orexis, which means sort of the broadest level of affectivity or desire. And one part of that is actually the will, the rational orexis, and we'll just put that aside for a moment. But then the lower part, which is kind of the appetites or the irrational desires, part of that is just a straightforward part that he calls the concupiscible part. It desires things. This is where we love and hate. And then we have this irascible part. And he uses that term. And he says it's not all about anger because hope and despair are also located there as well. But this part is concerned with things that are dealing with the good, but as the difficult good, as the good that we have to strive to attain rather than we can just direct ourselves towards and enjoy, or a good that can be threatened, or a good that has to be protected. So when we get angry, we're responding to a situation that's already, you could say, stressed or shot through with conflict or difficulties.
Yeah.
So that's kind of important. And then, he, as he typically does, you have to kind of piece together his account. It's not all in the treatise on emotions, but he gives you some good, taking Aristotle and Augustine and other thinkers, further synthesis of how we might adequately deal with anger, and when it could be legitimate, when it's going too far. So he's a really important person to study, I think.
Yeah. Have you ever been in a situation either in the classroom or with, I don't know, a family relationship or anything like that where you felt the anger coming on and then you've reminded yourself of some ancient or medieval thinker and you've kind of dialed back?
Yeah, actually I have. I mean, not quite so directly as, almost like having the angel and devil on your shoulder, or having Aquinas on your shoulder or something. Not quite so directly as that, but then, and sometimes it would also be, it wouldn't help me in the situation itself, but it would help me to not brood about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Or to reconcile with the person more quickly.
Yeah.
A lot of ethics I actually tell my students is how to unscrew up situations after we've managed to make a mess of them.
Right. Would you say that it's really the ancients and medievals who spent most of the time talking about this?
No. I mean, it continued on throughout the modern period.
Okay.
So you'll find, Descartes talking about it in The Passions of the Soul, for example. The thing that you do find, though, is there's often rather reductive treatments of it that don't do justice to how complex anger is as an emotion. They want to sort of like flatten out everything and put everything on the same level. And when you do that to anger, the account that you have becomes less useful. I'd say there's two other tendencies too as well. One is to, sort of subsume anger as a passion of the soul into something like aggressivity.
Yeah.
And I think some of the psychoanalytic literature did that, and in the process lost sight of what's distinctive about this emotion. So they became less good at handling it. And then there's also this tendency to say, well, anger is never good. It's never productive.
Yeah.
We want to get rid of it as much as possible.
Right.
And you see that among, like, say, not just certain psychologists, but also Jeremy Bentham.
Yeah.
And often with the psychologists, it'll be based in a sort of imposed value neutrality. Because anger, we get angry at people because we think there have been some wrongs done.
Yeah.
What makes us distinctively human anger as opposed to just animal responses that are like anger,
right,
is that we think that there's injustice.
Right. I wonder if this is partly due to kind of where we're at culturally with, emotivism and thinking, well, if there's no such thing as wrongs being done, but that doesn't actually mean anything, then I guess it makes sense to say your anger has no place either. Is that fair?
I guess, except that from an emotivist perspective, there's really no way to criticize a person approaching things out of a perspective of anger. They just happen to feel that way, and they have these preferences. And, you can say, well, I don't like you to feel that way, so I'm going to punish you or, silence you or something like that. But really, I think from an emotivist perspective, the greater danger is that we have no way of making distinctions between when anger is appropriate or productive and when it's not, or when it's on point or when it's off base. We do live in a culture that is, in many respects, emotivist in the way that, say, Alistair McIntyre uses the term. But it's also a culture that's shot through with lots and lots of anger.
Yeah. Yeah. And interestingly enough, a culture that has, in a lot of ways, a deep sense of moral indignation about things like sexual harassment right now, right?
Yeah. Or, being deprived of economic opportunities or all these other sort of things that depend on major assumptions being made.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about the notion that because things were a certain way economically in the past for 2 generations, that we all have a right to enjoy that going forward,
Right. So for raising kids as they lose their tempers and as they get angry.
Yeah.
What kinds of thoughts would you share with someone who's trying to raise kids and they get angry? I'm guessing you probably wouldn't just kind of tell your kids, like, don't ever get angry. Anger is a bad emotion. We don't get angry in this house.
I think the biggest mistake, and I've made this myself, is we get angry and then we yell at them about how they can't get angry. and then we give them this completely hypocritical example that basically tells them, well, you can't get angry now, but when you're in charge, or when you are the one who gets to call the shots, then you get to yell and shout and stuff like that.
Right.
I think it's very important too, by the way, when we do lose our temper, that we talk with the kids afterwards and say, I was wrong to yell at you. I was wrong to do this,
Yeah.
Because then they can come to understand how to do that themselves and that there's a necessity to do that.
Yeah.
And we rebuild our relationship that way.
Right.
I would say part of what we can do is it's very easy when we're in relationships with anybody close, whether it's kids or spouses or family of other sorts or friends, to once we get angry, there's a reasoning process that starts looking for all the patterns in how they've been behaving.
Yeah.
And engages in kind of a hyperbolic escalation of things. So instead of it just being about this one thing, you're doing that thing that you keep on doing that I can't stand, and I don't like it, and you see where the reasoning goes, right? Yeah. And then pretty soon they're a bad person in that respect.
Sure.
When we don't really want to conclude like that.
Yeah.
We can remind ourselves, as Epictetus tells us, about the relationship that we're in, and that the relationship matters more than the immediate situation. And we can also remind ourselves that we don't want to damage ourselves in the process by giving into these sorts of impulses.
Yeah.
And, if we do that, we also do less damage to our kids.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I don't know if you've seen the movie Anger Management. Have you seen it?
I have. Yeah, it's not bad. It's not great, but it's funny. It's a good Adam Sandler vehicle.
Right. There's a line in it that I always think about, that where Jack Nicholson says, like, there's 2 types of people who get angry. The person who is always yelling, and the person who's quiet and then comes in and, kills everyone in the grocery store or whatever.
Yeah. That's actually a good thing to bring up, though. There's this long-standing, we often call it the hydraulic theory of emotions and anger, that says, well, you got to discharge it, and if you're not venting it, then it's going to build up and it's going to blow.
Right.
And that actually turns out to be terrible advice.
Okay.
Now, there are some times where we do need to vent, but the venting is often less about getting to, discharge energy, and it's more about having somebody else hear and acknowledge us. So it's an interpersonal thing, more than just like I need to, smash something.
Yeah.
And if you indulge yourself in these over and over again venting actions, that builds habit.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, with other things, you need to do more of it later on. It doesn't feel like quite enough. It becomes mundane, So now you need to yell more or break something more or find something more biting to say to the other person.
Yeah.
And you don't want to get into that, because once you generate those sorts of habits, the biggest problem with anger is that it's so rational of an emotion. This is something that Aristotle spotted.
Yeah.
That's why he locates anger in a sort of special place when it comes to this. It's so rational that it syllogizes, he says.
Yeah.
But it does it badly. So it seduces our own rational capacities into its service, and then starts telling us all sorts of stories that are very plausible about why we should behave this way, or why it's okay for us to do that, or how bad the other people are.
Yeah.
And then it makes it difficult for us to reconcile too, because if we're still listening to those accounts, we feel as if we haven't gotten our vindication and the other person should give in first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe the last thing that I'm curious for you to talk about is the context that I'm in. So Christian, Protestant, evangelicalism, there's kind of a culture that would really push for never getting angry almost for any reason.
Yeah.
And so if someone has been truly wrongfully violated, there's kind of this like, well, you kind of need to sweep that under the rug. And for you to even feel any kind of anger or frustration about that is actually a bad thing. And so could you just speak a little bit more about the place of righteous indignation?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say too, and you can take this out of a religious context, is whatever sort of intentional mode of living we're doing, whether it's philosophy-based or religious-based or some sort of mix of the two, we have to start from where we are. And simply repressing things or saying, well, we have this ideal and I have to somehow map myself onto that ideal and deny everything that isn't that, that's a recipe for disaster.
Sure.
That's bad when we do it to ourselves, but when we impose that upon other people, especially people, because it's not usually the people who are like at the top who are being told that you don't get to be angry. It's usually imposed from higher onto lower.
Yeah.
And so when we deny other people their opportunity to be angry and to express anger, oftentimes because we're uncomfortable with it. I mean, from a theological perspective, I would say that's sinful behavior. It actually does distance us from neighbor and from God and damages us in who we are. And it usually stems from, probably an inability to handle our own emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that you should never get angry. There are some people who've held that ideal. Some of them were philosophers, like I pointed out too, the Stoics.
Right.
But that's an ideal. That's the end point. That's not where we have to be right now.
Yeah.
Even, Christ showed angry behavior at the moneylenders in the temple, so.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that often that's not helpful. Now, indignation, interestingly, Aristotle makes a distinction between indignation and anger. Anger is something that is centered on ourselves, although it can extend very easily to others. So I get angry because you insult or show contempt or hurt me in some way or damage the things that I have, or you do that to somebody that I care about or identify with, somebody literally who's one of ours. Indignation is when, for Aristotle, the word for that, by the way, is nemesis. That happens when we're not directly involved, but we see some wrong being done and we're distanced from it, but we can still recognize it as wrong, and we don't like the bad person getting away with doing something bad to somebody good or somebody neutral. And what's the room or the scope for that? Well, you can get angry, and anger can sometimes motivate you to do the right thing that you wouldn't have the energy to do, or the maybe the courage to do if you weren't actually at that point getting angry, especially when there's been like repeated offenses. So, you think about the spouse who finally confronts his or her fellow spouse about the household accounts and, why is this money being frivolously spent out of the little that we earn on this stuff, and they've put up with it for a while. Maybe it's okay for them to blow up about that. Maybe that's what the other person needs sometimes to say, oh, this is serious.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that then they should indulge themselves in whatever. And the last thing I'll say too is quite often again, this goes to the issue of those who are vulnerable or in the weaker positions.
Yeah.
Quite often they've been required to suppress their anger for a long time. And when it comes out, it can be very scary.
Yeah.
But sometimes it really does need to come out and be acknowledged. It's very difficult if somebody's angry at you for you screwing up for a long time to be in the same room as them and say, I hear you, what you're saying is legitimate. But that's often what we need for genuine healing to take place and then real forgiveness.
Yeah. I'm curious because the Christian point of view, it seems like the end of all this is reconciliation and restoration of relationship.
Yeah.
I wonder if these Greek thinkers, like if that's the way they think about it as well.
For some of them it is.
Okay.
Epictetus, again, great example of a Stoic. He recognizes that we will get angry and he helps us analyze what we're angry about. And then he tells us that, when we're faced with relationships with people who disappoint us or don't treat us as well as we'd like them to, we have options in how we approach them. He's got that famous, you can pick things up by two handles. One you can bear it with, the other you can't bear it with. And the example there is of a brother who's a jerk. Your brother's a jerk. Epictetus doesn't say, that's just a projection on your part. No, he says your brother's a jerk.
Yeah.
And acts like a jerk. It's up to you to decide how you're going to think about it. Are you going to focus on the fact that he's a jerk and he doesn't give you what you feel the relationship demands of him? Or are you going to focus on the fact that he is your brother and you still have the option of doing, what you can do? He's not saying endure abuse forever or anything like that.
Yeah.
But he is saying that we have some measure of control in what we do with this. And that's true even if we're like terrible with anger. I mean, I can lose my temper, but I still have some degree of control whether I punch a hole in the wall or go take a walk.
Yeah.
Or whether I hold a grudge or don't hold a grudge.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much for all that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Was there anything else you wanted to share about this topic?
Well, for your listeners, I would just say there's so much great literature out there in the philosophical and theological and also in drama, too. Some really interesting reflections, beginning with the Greeks and then continuing all the way through. There's some really, just a wealth of literature out there engaging with anger once you sort of start paying attention to it. So, like with my videos, I always tell viewers, don't let the videos become a substitute
Sure.
or intermediary between you and the text. Go out and read these things and dig around and you'll find a lot of great usable insights available.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you just tell us where we can find your videos real quick?
Yeah, I have a video channel. If you just type in, Gregory B. Sadler in YouTube or Google, it'll come up right away. There's about 1,500 videos in there right now.
Yeah.
The other places people can find me are on Twitter at Philosopher70. I have a Facebook author page. And I actually do have a podcast. And that's just called Sadler's Lectures on SoundCloud.
Okay. That's great. I've come across your videos and have found them very helpful for my own preparation and lectures, and I'm very grateful for that resource. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and share with your friends.